Ryan's office revenge. They handed me the termination letter at 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I read every word twice, signed 3 copies, collected my belongings, and walked out. At 2:13 a.m., my phone erupted with an unknown number. The voice on the other end belonged to their senior counsel, and it was shaking. "Mr. Patterson, please tell me you didn't actually sign those documents." I smiled in the darkness of my bedroom. "I signed exactly what you presented to me. You might want to check Section 7, subsection C. Terminations based on performance deficiencies require documented performance improvement plans attached as appendix materials. I see no appendices. Your move. Let me tell you who I am first. Michael Anthony Patterson, 48 years old. And until that Wednesday afternoon, Senior Engineering Director at Apex Industrial Technologies. 22 years I'd given them, working my way up from junior engineer to running a department of 45 people. I'd overseen $240 million in safety compliance projects, designed the protocols that kept our automotive manufacturing lines running without a single OSHA violation for 8 years straight. I knew every bolt, every regulation, every safety standard that made our operation work. The termination package sat on my dining room table at 11:23 p.m. that Wednesday night. 3 identical copies, each one signed with my full legal name. Michael Anthony Patterson. Every signature line executed. Every initial placed where those ridiculous yellow tabs indicated. I'd spent 47 minutes reading through all 28 pages of legal documentation that Apex had prepared for my departure. The severance terms were decent enough. 24 weeks of pay, benefits through March. Standard non-compete and non-disclosure language. Nothing unusual there. What caught my attention wasn't what they'd included. It was what they'd forgotten to attach. Section 7. Subsection C, buried on page 9, between clauses about intellectual property and company equipment return. In cases where termination results from documented performance deficiencies, this agreement shall incorporate by reference all performance improvement plans, warning notices, and evaluative materials relevant to said deficiencies attached herein as Appendix B and forming the factual basis for separation. I'd written that language myself 6 years ago when I'd been promoted to senior director and had been asked to overhaul Apex's employment policies. Too many good engineers had been dismissed on vague accusations. Too many careers destroyed with no paper trail, no accountability, no recourse. I'd seen it happen to colleagues who'd been with the company longer than some of the managers making the decisions. So I'd built protections into the system. Protections that required documentation, evidence, due process. Protections that Apex's HR department had apparently forgotten existed when they decided to fire me for consistent performance deficiencies and failure to adapt to modern engineering practices. My phone lit up the darkness. Unknown caller. Area code 617, Boston, where Apex maintained their legal operations center. I let it ring 7 times before answering, curious to see who was working at 2 in the morning. Michael Patterson speaking. "Mr. Patterson, this is Brian Sullivan from Apex Industrial Legal Counsel." His voice carried a tremor I'd never heard in our previous interactions during contract reviews. I apologize profusely for the late hour, but I need to ask you something urgent about the separation documents provided this afternoon. "I'm listening, Brian. Did you execute the non-disclosure provisions of the termination agreement?" I glanced at the papers on my table, my signature on page 22, directly above the NDA section. I signed everything Apex provided me exactly as your HR director specified. "Mr. Patterson, I need you to understand something critical. There may have been a documentation error in the materials we supplied. We're prepared to offer you a chance to review revised paperwork." "What sort of error?" My voice remained perfectly neutral, but I could hear multiple voices in the background. This wasn't just Brian working late. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics telephonically, but if you haven't yet executed the agreement, we'd appreciate scheduling a meeting to address certain corrections. I executed all documents at approximately 7:15 p.m. this evening. I scanned the completed package and transmitted it to your HR department at 7:38 p.m. Is something wrong with your documentation? The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Background voices filtered through more clearly now. Someone was definitely conducting an emergency meeting at Apex's legal offices at 2 in the morning, and it sounded like more than just a couple of people. Mr. Patterson. Brian's voice returned, tighter now, with less of the professional composure I'd come to expect from him. Can you clarify what you mean by executed all documents? I mean, I signed the separation agreement as presented. Every page initialed where indicated. Every signature line completed. The full 28-page document that HR Director Lisa Matthews provided during my termination meeting at 4:15 p.m. today. And the appendices. Did you review the attached appendices? What appendices? The document I received contained no appendices, just the 28-page separation agreement. I kept my voice level, but inside I was starting to understand why they were panicking. Another extended silence. I heard someone curse distinctly in the background, and then what sounded like papers rustling urgently. Then Brian's voice, barely maintaining professional composure. Mr. Patterson, the separation agreement should have included appendix materials. Specifically, if termination was classified as performance-based, there should have been performance improvement documentation attached as Appendix B. Should have been, Brian. Interesting phrasing. Because according to Section 7, subsection C of the separation agreement I signed, performance-based terminations must be accompanied by PIP documentation. Not should be. Must be. Quote, this agreement shall incorporate by reference all performance improvement plans, warning notices, and evaluative materials relevant to said deficiencies attached herein as Appendix B and forming the factual basis for separation. End quote. Dead silence. I could practically hear the lawyers realizing the magnitude of their mistake. I count 0 appendices attached to the document I received and signed, I continued, my engineering background kicking in with methodical precision. Which means either my termination wasn't actually performance-based, in which case you need to explain why your termination letter explicitly states failure to adapt to modern engineering practices, or my termination was performance-based, but you failed to provide the mandatory documentation, rendering the separation agreement invalid because it violates your own contractual requirements. Mr. Patterson. Either way, Brian, I believe we'll be seeing each other in court. I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be exceptionally long for Apex's legal team. I ended the call before he could respond. The satisfaction was immediate but measured. 22 years in engineering had taught me to verify everything twice before making conclusions, and this felt like the most important verification of my career. My wife Sandra had been listening from the hallway, probably wondering why I was taking calls at 2 in the morning. You planned this? She asked, stepping into the kitchen where I was pouring myself a glass of water. I planned for the possibility they might terminate me without following proper procedures, I said. I wrote those procedures specifically to prevent what happened today. Vague performance accusations with no documentation, no improvement plans, no objective metrics. Just corporate speak designed to get rid of people they don't want anymore. What happens now? Now we wait to see if they attempt to fabricate documentation retroactively, which constitutes fraud, or claim the appendix materials aren't actually required, contradicting their written policy, or try to settle this quietly before it becomes public knowledge that they systematically fire senior engineers without proper documentation. Which outcome do you want? Honestly, I want them to take me to court. Discovery in a wrongful termination lawsuit would expose how many others they've dismissed using identical vague performance accusations without proper documentation. I'm betting that number is substantially higher than Apex wants their investors to know. Let me back up and explain how I got to this point. The termination meeting had been brief and uncomfortable. Lisa Matthews from HR and Stephen Rodriguez, the new VP of Engineering who'd been hired 6 months ago from a competitor. Stephen was 39 years old, had an MBA and consulting background, and had made abundantly clear from day one that he considered Apex's engineering approach outdated and overly conservative. He'd used phrases like legacy mindset and resistance to innovation in almost every department meeting since his arrival. "Michael, we need to discuss a serious matter regarding your performance," Stephen had begun, staring at his notepad rather than making eye contact. "Multiple stakeholders have raised concerns about your resistance to new engineering methodologies and your failure to adapt to changing industry standards. After thorough consideration, we've determined your performance doesn't meet Apex's evolving needs. We're terminating your employment effective immediately. What specific performance deficiencies are you referencing?" I'd asked directly. I'd learned in my years managing engineers that specificity was everything. You can't solve problems with generalities. The specifics are documented in your personnel file. What matters now is transition planning. We need to ensure continuity in your projects. I'd like to review that documentation of alleged performance deficiencies before we proceed. "That's not necessary for this discussion," Lisa had interjected quickly, clearly uncomfortable with my request. "We're prepared to offer you a separation package if you sign the agreement today. 24 weeks of severance, which is quite generous considering the circumstances." They'd slid the document across the conference table. I'd taken 35 minutes to read it thoroughly while they sat in uncomfortable silence. Lisa kept checking her watch, and Stephen kept looking at his phone. The terms were standard enough. 24 weeks of severance equaling roughly $75,000, benefits through March, standard non-compete and non-disparagement language. But what had captured my attention was the termination classification. Termination for cause, performance deficiency, and the complete absence of any attached performance improvement plans or evaluative documentation. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 years ago, when I'd written the policy requiring PIP documentation for performance terminations, I'd been thinking about protecting other engineers from exactly what was happening to me. I'd seen too many good people walked out the door with vague explanations and no recourse. The policy was designed to force managers to either properly document performance issues or admit that the termination was really about something else. I'd signed it anyway, initialed every page, executed every signature line, because I knew something Stephen and Lisa apparently didn't know. Their own policy required PIP documentation for performance terminations. By signing an agreement that lacked those materials, I was documenting their policy violation. It was like they'd handed me a loaded weapon and asked me to sign my name on it. The next morning brought clarity about what I was really up against. Thursday morning at 8:14 a.m., I received an email from Brian Sullivan that confirmed my suspicions. "Mr. Patterson, following our conversation last night, Apex Industrial would like to offer you the opportunity to meet and discuss revised separation documentation that addresses certain procedural oversights in the original materials. We believe revised documentation would serve both parties' interests. Can you be available Monday morning at 10 o'clock a.m. at our offices? Regards, Brian Sullivan, Senior Counsel, Apex Industrial Technologies." I forwarded the email to my attorney, Karen Reynolds, who specialized in executive employment litigation and had represented numerous corporate executives in wrongful termination disputes. I'd known Karen for 8 years through professional networks, and she had a reputation for being thorough and relentless when companies tried to cut corners on employment law. "They're panicking," Karen said when I called her 15 minutes later. They realized they terminated you without following their own procedures, and now they want to fix it after the fact. The fact that their senior counsel is reaching out at 8 a.m. the morning after a 2 a.m. emergency call tells me they spent all night trying to figure out how badly they messed up. Can they do that? Just revise the documentation after I've already signed? Not really. You already executed their agreement. They accepted your signature by processing your termination. They can't now claim the agreement was invalid simply because they made documentation errors. Either the agreement is valid as signed, meaning they violated their own policy, or the agreement is invalid, meaning your termination is also invalid. Either way, they're in a difficult position. This was exactly the kind of logical trap that appealed to my engineering mind. Binary choices with clear consequences. No middle ground, no creative interpretations. So what should I do about this Monday meeting? I asked Karen. Attend the meeting. Bring me with you. Let's see what they're willing to offer to make this disappear, but don't expect them to admit fault. They're going to try to present this as a simple administrative oversight that they can fix with revised paperwork. Monday morning, Karen and I arrived at Apex's headquarters at 9:52 a.m. The building looked the same as it had for 22 years, but walking in as a terminated employee felt surreal. We were escorted to a large conference room where Brian Sullivan waited with two people I didn't recognize. A man in his 50s who introduced himself as Daniel Walsh from Apex's outside counsel firm, and a woman in her mid-40s who turned out to be Nancy Foster, Apex's chief financial officer. "Mr. Patterson, thank you for coming," Brian began, trying to project confidence that hadn't been there during our 2 a.m. phone call. "I think we can resolve this situation constructively." "I'm listening," I said. Daniel Walsh opened a tablet and pulled up a document. "We've prepared revised separation documentation that addresses the procedural issues with the original materials. The revised agreement includes the performance improvement documentation that should have been attached to the original, properly documenting the performance deficiencies that led to your termination." "You created performance improvement plans after the termination?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "We obtained written documentation of performance concerns that had previously been communicated verbally. We're now providing them in written form as required by policy." Karen leaned forward. "Mr. Walsh, performance improvement plans for a termination should be created and implemented before the termination, not fabricated afterward. Creating them retroactively to justify a termination decision that's already been executed is not consistent with proper employment procedures. The documentation reflects genuine concerns that were communicated to Mr. Patterson prior to his termination," Daniel said carefully. "Then why wasn't it documented at the time?" Karen asked. "Why wasn't it attached to the original separation agreement as required by Apex's own policy? There was an administrative oversight. We're correcting it now. An oversight that happened to benefit Apex by allowing them to terminate Mr. Patterson without providing required documentation." "Convenient." Nancy Foster spoke for the first time. "Mr. Patterson, perhaps we can approach this differently. Apex is prepared to offer enhanced severance terms. 32 weeks of severance instead of 24, extended benefits continuation for 18 months, and a mutual agreement not to pursue litigation in exchange for signing the revised separation agreement with the attached performance documentation." Karen and I exchanged glances. They were essentially offering to pay me an additional 8 weeks of severance, approximately $50,000, to accept documentation that should have been provided initially. "What's in the performance documentation?" I asked. "What specific deficiencies am I allegedly being accused of?" Daniel turned his tablet toward me for written documents, each from different Apex managers, Document 1 from Mark Torres, engineering manager, claimed I had failed to embrace new key ID technologies and created bottlenecks in the design review process. Document 2 from Helen Brooks, senior project manager, claimed I had demonstrated inflexibility during budget planning meetings and refused to implement cost-cutting measures. Document 3 from Richard Coleman, former VP of Engineering, claimed I had shown resistance to industry-standard methodologies and failed to adapt to changing technical requirements. Document 4 from Stephen Rodriguez himself claimed I had consistently underperformed against modernization initiatives and shown unwillingness to accept feedback. I read each document carefully, my engineering background automatically scanning for technical accuracy and logical consistency. They were vague, non-specific, and critically, none included specific dates, specific incidents, specific metrics, or specific examples of the alleged deficiencies. These documents are completely generic, I said. Mark claims I failed to embrace new KAD technologies, but doesn't cite a single specific technology or implementation timeline. Helen claims I showed inflexibility, but doesn't identify which meeting, which budget line item, or which specific decision. Richard claims I resisted industry standards, but doesn't specify which standards, which industry guidelines, or when this resistance allegedly occurred. Then I noticed something else that made my engineering instincts kick into high alert mode. Richard Coleman hasn't worked at Apex for 4 months. He resigned to take a position at Boeing. How is he providing performance documentation about my current work? Daniel's expression froze momentarily. Mr. Coleman provided the documentation based on his observations during his employment. Mr. Coleman left Apex before Stephen Rodriguez even joined the company. He couldn't possibly have observations about my performance under Stephen's leadership, which is supposedly when these performance issues became termination-worthy. You're using testimony from someone who wasn't even present during the relevant time period. Karen was typing rapidly on her laptop. Mr. Walsh, using a former employee who left the company months before the alleged performance issues as a witness, significantly undermines the credibility of this documentation. A jury would have substantial questions about why Apex couldn't find current employees willing to provide documentation critical enough to justify termination. Mr. Coleman's employment status doesn't invalidate his professional observations about Mr. Patterson's performance patterns, Daniel said, but his voice carried less conviction than it had 10 minutes earlier. Actually, it does, Karen said, because it suggests Apex couldn't find current managers willing to provide sufficiently critical documentation. So they reached out to a former employee who has no current knowledge of Mr. Patterson's work. That's not proper documentation. That's desperation. We're not going to debate the validity of the performance documentation, Brian Sullivan said, trying to regain control of the meeting. The offer is on the table. 32-week severance, extended benefits, mutual release. Mr. Patterson needs to decide if he wants to accept it or pursue litigation that will be expensive and time-consuming for everyone. We'll need time to consider, Karen said, standing. Mr. Patterson will respond to your offer within 72 hours. We left Apex's offices at 11:17 a.m. In Karen's car, she turned to me with a slight smile. They're terrified. Did you see how quickly they tried to move past the Richard Coleman issue? They know that using a former employee who wasn't even present during the relevant time period is going to look terrible in court. So, what do? We investigate. We find out how many other people Apex has terminated for vague performance deficiencies without proper documentation. We build a pattern and practice case showing this isn't just about you. It's about systematic policy violations. Then we take them to court. Over the next 3 weeks, Karen's firm conducted extensive discovery. They contacted former Apex employees through professional networks and LinkedIn. They requested public records from state employment agencies. They reviewed court filings from other employment disputes involving Apex. What they found was damning. In the past 3 years, Apex had terminated 22 employees for performance deficiencies. Of those 22 terminations, 16 had been classified as requiring performance improvement documentation under company policy. Of those 16, only 4 had actually included attached PIP materials at the time of termination. The other 12 had been fired without the required documentation. More importantly, Karen discovered a disturbing pattern. Nearly every performance deficiency termination had involved engineers over 45. The average age of terminated engineers was 51. Their average tenure was 16 years. They were being replaced by engineers averaging 31 years old at 65% of the previous salary. Owen Ashford, the new CEO who'd been brought in 8 months ago from a consulting firm, had a documented history of this behavior. Karen found court records showing he'd been named in 3 wrongful termination lawsuits at his previous employer, all alleging he'd fired experienced employees on fabricated performance accusations. 2 cases had settled confidentially. 1 had gone to trial and resulted in a $1.2 million verdict against the employer. "Michael, I think we have enough to file," Karen said during a meeting in early December. "We can demonstrate that Apex has a pattern of terminating senior engineers without following their own policies. We can show that this new leadership specifically has a documented history of this behavior. And we can prove your termination violated both company policy and basic procedural fairness. What are we asking for? Reinstatement with back pay, or in the alternative, substantial damages for wrongful termination, age discrimination, and reputational harm, plus attorney's fees. I'm thinking we start at $2,200,000 and see what they counter with." We filed the lawsuit on December 3, 2024, in Massachusetts Superior Court. The complaint alleged breach of contract, wrongful termination, age discrimination, and violation of employment policies. We requested $2,200,000 in damages plus reinstatement. Apex's motion to dismiss was denied in February 2025. Judge Joseph Martinez ruled that genuine questions existed about whether Apex followed its own policies and whether the separation agreement was valid when it omitted required documentation. That ruling changed everything. Discovery meant Apex would have to produce documents showing how they handled other performance terminations. But then we hit the jackpot. During discovery in March 2025, Karen's firm subpoenaed Apex's internal emails. What we found was a smoking gun that proved everything I'd suspected. 3 weeks before my termination, Stephen Rodriguez had sent an email to Lisa Matthews and Nancy Foster with the subject line Q4 Cost Reduction Strategy. The email read, "We need to reduce engineering overhead by $1,400,000 before year-end to hit board targets. Recommend targeting senior engineering staff with highest compensation packages. Michael Patterson, $162,000. Base plus bonus is top of list. He's resistant to the new efficiency initiatives. Let's move on this quickly. What's the cleanest termination path?" Lisa had responded, "Performance-based termination requires PIP documentation per Policy Section 7C. We don't have current PIPs for Michael. Creating documentation now would take 90 to 120 days minimum." Stephen's response, "Don't have that kind of time. Can we use past performance reviews or general feedback from managers?" Nancy had chimed in, "Legal will want something in writing to justify performance termination. Can we get managers to document recent concerns retroactively?" Lisa. I can reach out to Mark, Helen, and Richard for written statements about performance concerns. Stephen. Perfect. Get those statements and let's move forward. Keep this tight. Don't want him getting advanced warning. That email chain proved several critical things. First, my termination wasn't about performance at all. It was about cost reduction. Stephen needed to cut $1,400,000 from the engineering budget to meet board targets, and firing senior staff was the fastest path. Second, they knew they were supposed to have PIP documentation, but decided to fabricate it after the fact. Third, they deliberately tried to keep it quiet to prevent me from defending myself. When Karen showed me those emails, I felt vindicated and disgusted simultaneously. Vindicated because it proved everything I'd suspected. Disgusted because it showed how little they valued the careers they were destroying. We amended our complaint to include the email evidence and add punitive damages. We increased our damages demand to $2,800,000. That's when Apex's settlement offers got serious. Within 2 weeks of filing the amended complaint, Daniel Walsh called Karen with a new offer, $2,100,000. They're panicking, Karen told me. Those emails are devastating. No jury is going to side with Apex when they see executives openly discussing how to circumvent their own policies to fire someone for budget reasons. We countered at $2,400,000. Apex came back at $2,200,000. We countered at $300,000. They accepted. The final settlement, signed in May 2025, included $750,000 payment to me, written admission by Apex that my termination did not follow proper company procedures, no confidentiality clause whatsoever, and agreement by Apex to conduct a third-party audit of recent performance deficiency terminations. The written admission was crucial. Most settlements include no admission of wrongdoing, but the email evidence was so damning that Apex agreed to admit they'd violated their own procedures. That admission meant other Apex employees who'd been terminated under similar circumstances could use Apex's admission as evidence in their own cases. Within 6 months of our settlement becoming public, 8 more former Apex employees filed lawsuits alleging wrongful termination with improper documentation. All 8 referenced the written admission Apex had made in my settlement. All cases settled within 4 months for amounts ranging from $285,000 to $950,000. 7 months after the settlement, I received a phone call from Anthony Phillips, who'd been on Apex's board of directors during my termination. Michael, I wanted you to know something. The third-party audit you required found significant policy violations in how Apex was handling terminations. 12 employees who'd been fired for performance deficiencies without proper documentation. The board has approved a remediation fund to compensate those employees for approximately $3,200,000 total. Stephen Rodriguez has been asked to resign. The entire HR department has been restructured, and we've implemented new oversight procedures to ensure terminations follow proper documentation requirements. Why are you telling me this? Because your lawsuit did more than get you compensation. It forced us to fix a broken system. Senior engineers at Apex are better protected now because you refused to accept a separation agreement that violated policy requirements. The total cost to Apex of Stephen's cost reduction strategy, approximately $8,900,000 in settlements, legal fees, restructuring costs, plus Stephen's resignation, plus the reputational damage of having multiple wrongful termination lawsuits become public. All to save $1,400,000 in engineering overhead. I started consulting for other corporations on engineering management best practices, including how to structure employment policies that protect both companies and employees. My experience became a case study about why documentation requirements matter and what happens when they're ignored. During one conference, someone asked me, "What should employees do if they think they're being fired improperly?" Read your separation agreement carefully. Every page, every clause. Look for what's missing, not just what's there. If your company has policies about termination procedures, check if those procedures were followed. Most people don't do this. They're overwhelmed, worried about money and insurance. They sign whatever is put in front of them just to get it over with. But I understood that taking 35 minutes to read that separation agreement carefully and noticing the missing appendix materials changed everything. It turned a standard termination into a $1,750,000 solar settlement and exposed a pattern that protected 12 other employees. The real lesson isn't just about reading documents carefully. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corporate wrongdoing is the very system they're trying to circumvent, and the person best positioned to wield that weapon is the one who helped build it in the first place.